I have been asked, in the years since, what I was thinking as I walked into the Audit deliberative chamber that morning. The honest answer is that I was not thinking about the vote. I already knew how it would go. I had read the motion, read the procedural filings, and read the 7 members of the auditing committee named in the annexure, read them the way I have always read political bodies, meaning slowly, over years, from a seat near the back of the room where no one notices the woman with a notepad. What I was thinking about, if I am truthful, was the filing code on the document sleeve I was carrying. The Concordance's own reference system. Audit Administrative Series, Cycle 44, Classification, Internal Personnel Assessment, Origin, Mission Diplomatic, Velhari Concordance. I had used their code deliberately. I thought that was a reasonable touch. You need to understand what the Velhari Concordance was before you understand what happened inside it. The Concordance was not a young institution. It had been deliberating, in one form or another, for 6,000 years before humanity built its first telescope. It had absorbed 11 species into its membership framework, arbitrated 4 interstellar boundary disputes, and outlasted 2 empires that had tried to consume it. It was procedurally meticulous in a way that no human institution has ever managed, and it was proud of this in the way that only very old things can be proud, quietly, structurally, as if pride itself had been written into the load-bearing walls. When the Concordance voted to admit the human diplomatic mission 18 years earlier, it did so on the understanding that the mission was an observer body, not a member, not a partner, a watched presence, provisionally tolerated, pending a full integration review that the Concordance reserved the right to schedule at any time of its choosing. They had not scheduled one. For 18 years, they had not scheduled one, because the mission had given them no cause to, or so they believed. The motion for a compulsory intelligence audit was introduced by Councillor Velhari in the 3rd week of the Cycle 44 session. Velhari was the chair of the Concordance's Internal Security Subcommittee, a position he had held for 11 years. He was tall, even by Velhari standards, with the pale grey colouring of the elder caste and the multi-lobed cranial structure that the Velhari associated with deliberative acuity. He spoke slowly. He always spoke slowly, which the Velhari took as a mark of care, and which I had taken, over the course of 9 years of watching him, as a mark of something else. The motion read as follows: that the human diplomatic mission, operating under provisional observer status, be required to submit to a full intelligence and psychological assessment, conducted by a 7-member Velhari auditing committee, covering all personnel files, all mission communications from the preceding 5 years, and all psychological evaluations held by the mission's own records office. The rationale offered was procedural. The integration review, long deferred, was being formally initiated. This was simply its first step. No one in the chamber, watching the motion be read into the record, seemed to think that was quite what it was. I was sitting in the observer gallery when the motion was read. Our mission had 3 people in that gallery: myself, Deputy Attaché Cale Domus, and our junior liaison officer, a young man named Ferris whose primary function at that point was to hold the communication log and look uncomfortable. Cale looked at me when the motion finished being read. I did not look back. I was watching Velhari's hands. The Velhari indicate emotional state through the positioning of the secondary fingers, the smaller pair on the outer edge of each hand, which they hold in a neutral curl when composed and extend slightly when under some form of internal pressure. Velhari's secondary fingers were extended. He had been careful with his voice, but he had not thought about his hands. He was not confident. He was performing confidence for the record. I noted this, as I had noted a great many things about Velhari over 9 years. The motion was referred to a scheduling committee, which gave us 48 hours before we were required to respond formally. Our mission's protocol officer filed a standard acknowledgement. I filed nothing. What I did during those 48 hours is not, I think, especially interesting in the telling. I did what I had been doing, in one form or another, for 19 years of diplomatic postings across 7 different councils and assemblies. I wrote. I organized what I had already written. I cross-referenced. I made certain that the document I was preparing bore the correct administrative classification under the Concordance's own filing system, because a document filed incorrectly is a document that can be set aside on procedural grounds, and I had no interest in giving Velhari that option. The document was not, to be precise, a rebuttal. It was not a protest. It was not a request for reconsideration, and it contained no legal argument. It was a personnel assessment. Specifically, it was a psychological and professional assessment of all 7 members of the auditing committee named in Motion 44 Cycle 7, including Councillor Velhari himself. Each entry ran to approximately 4 pages. Each entry covered deliberative history, decision patterns under institutional pressure, stated positions versus recorded votes, the gap between each councillor's public procedural reasoning and the outcomes that reasoning had historically produced, and, in the case of 3 committee members, documented instances in which their stated rationale had been factually inconsistent with the classified session transcripts that the Concordance's own archive had released under its 20-year disclosure rule. I had been attending concordance sessions for 9 of those 19 years. I had attended many of the open sessions in which those 3 councillors had spoken. I take thorough notes. I always have. No one in the concordance had ever asked me what I wrote in them, because I was, as far as the concordance's working assumption was concerned, an observer, a watched presence, provisionally tolerated. The document ran to 31 pages. I had it sealed in a standard administrative sleeve under the concordance's own filing code at 0640 on the morning of the response deadline. We were summoned to the floor at 0900, the full chamber session. All 7 deliberative bodies of the concordance present, in the tiered seating that curved in a wide arc around the floor, pale grey faces in the warm-lit upper tiers and the cooler-lit lower ones, the soft ambient sound of the ventilation system and the shuffle of procedural tablets. The chamber smelled, as it always did, of the dry mineral quality that came from the stone used in the original construction. Audit was an old station, and they had brought stone from the home world when they built it. I had always found this detail worth thinking about. They had carried stone across space so the chamber would smell right. Velhari was seated at the central table, flanked by the 6 other members of the auditing committee. The rest of the senior council occupied the curved tiered seating above and behind him. The chamber chair, a senior councillor named Velhari who had held that position for 22 years, was at the elevated desk at the far end of the floor. She was reading the session agenda when we entered. Protocol required that the mission's senior representative stand before the table and wait for the session to be formally opened. I stood before the table. Cale stood 2 steps behind my left shoulder. Ferris was behind him. Velhari looked up from her desk. She began to read the session opening, the formal recitation of the motion, the purpose of the session, the procedural rights of the respondent party, the timeline for the audit process if the motion was confirmed by the full chamber. I let her get through approximately half of it. Then I placed the document sleeve on the table in front of Velhari, turned, and walked out. I did not look back. I did not pause at the door. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the document did not say more precisely. Cale and Ferris followed me. I heard the chamber behind us, not noise, exactly, but the quality of silence that a large room produces when a large number of people stop moving at the same moment. The Velhari are not a loud species. They do not shout, but they went very still, and that stillness had a texture to it that I had not heard from them before. We took the north corridor back toward the mission offices. It was a 7-minute walk. Ferris asked me, quietly, about a third of the way along it, what was in the document. I told him it was a personnel file. He did not ask a follow-up question. We waited in the mission offices for 4 hours and 17 minutes before we heard anything from a chamber. I should be precise about those 4 hours. I was not anxious during them. I understood, with reasonable certainty, what was happening. Velhari had the document. She would have passed it to Velhari. Velhari would have read his own entry first, because that is what people do, and then, given the cross-reference structure I had used, he would have been directed to the entries for the 3 councillors whose stated rationale had diverged from their recorded votes, because the document was organised to compel a certain order of reading. What I did not know, and could not predict with certainty, was what they would do after reading it. The concordance had many procedural options available to it. It could have pressed forward with the audit. It could have referred the document to its own internal review body, which would have taken approximately 2 years and resulted in a formal finding that was almost certainly not going to go anywhere useful for either party. It could have requested a session recess and a private meeting with the mission, which would have been the cleanest resolution. It could, in theory, have expelled the mission entirely. I considered this possibility with the same weight I gave the others. It was not the most likely outcome, but it was not negligible. I had written a precise, factually supported, procedurally impeccable document about the private deliberative failings of 7 of the Concordance's senior members. There are institutions that respond to that kind of clarity by reforming their process. There are institutions that respond by removing the source of the clarity. I had made a judgment, after 19 years, about which kind of institution the Velhari Concordance was. I still believed I was right, sitting in the mission offices during those 4 hours, but I was aware that I was betting on a reading, not a certainty. At 1347, Caloritha's administrative secretary sent a formal communication to the mission's protocol office. The language was exact, as concordance communications always are. It stated that Motion 44 Cycle 7 had been withdrawn from the session agenda by the motion sponsor. It stated that the scheduled audit of the Human Diplomatic Mission had been suspended pending an internal procedural review of the Auditing Committee's composition and mandate, to be conducted under Cycle 44's disclosure and review protocols. It stated that the Chamber Chair extended her regards to the mission's senior representative and requested, at the senior representative's convenience, a private meeting to discuss the mission's upcoming integration review. There was a postscript. It was a single sentence, and it was the only part of the communication that Calorith had written in a register that departed from formal concordance administrative language. It said, "The Chair notes that the document submitted by the mission this morning has been entered into the Concordance's Cycle 44 administrative record under the mission's own filing reference." She had kept it. She had filed it in their own archive. I thought about that for a while. The private meeting happened 3 days later. I went alone. Calorith received me in one of the smaller working rooms of the main chamber, not the formal floor, not the tiered seating and the stone smell, but a practical room with a long table and a window that looked out across the station's docking arm. She was already seated when I arrived. She did not offer a formal opening. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, in the careful, deliberate way that the Velhari use when they are choosing words with the understanding that the words will be remembered, that she had read the document in full. I said I was glad it was useful. She said that several members of the Auditing Committee had also read it. She said that Vetharan had not returned to the chamber since the session was suspended. I did not say anything to that. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me, with the secondary fingers of both hands in a precise neutral curl, how long I had been keeping notes of this kind. I told her 19 years. Since my first posting, as a junior liaison to a border assembly that no longer exists. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked back at me and said that the integration review would proceed on a revised timeline, under a revised committee structure, and that she hoped the mission would participate in good faith. I said that we had always participated in good faith. She said she understood that now. That was the end of the meeting. It lasted 11 minutes. I have thought about those 11 minutes many times in the years since, about what she was and was not saying, about what the Concordance understood, in the end, about the nature of its 18-year oversight of the human mission, the watched presence, provisionally tolerated, the quiet figure in the observer gallery who had been filling notebooks while the chamber assumed it was doing the watching. Vetharan never returned to the chamber. I don't know what his entry said to him that others couldn't. A document that precise, about a person that specific, tends to be a private thing to read. I left that for him. The integration review concluded 14 months later. The mission status was revised to associate member, the first such designation the Concordance had extended in 30 years. Calorith presided over the vote. She read the result into the record in the same measured tone she used for everything. But when she set the procedural tablet down, her secondary fingers were in a perfect, deliberate curl. I wrote that down too.